Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So it's very important to know about different roles in the technology space, right? Like from Android developer, front-end developer, full stack developer. So today I want to focus on iOS development. So I had invited Sejal, who is currently working as an iOS developer at GetMyParking. And today we'll be discussing on what is iOS development, how one can become an iOS developer, what are the resources and much more. First of all, thanks a lot Sejal for coming here. If you can give a quick introduction to our audience, it would be helpful.
Sure. Hi everyone, my name is Sejal Khanna and I graduated last year, 2022. I completed my BTech in computer science from DCE, that's in Gurgaon. And right in my third year itself, I started with an internship as a full-time intern at one bank as an iOS developer itself, wherein I actually got a chance to work on the main product directly because the team was pretty small. Thereafter, after completing an entire year of internship, I joined GetMyParking as an iOS developer and have been working in iOS development since. And yeah, that's about it.
Cool. So the first question is, what is iOS development, right? People generally know what is app development, but what is iOS development specifically?
So iOS is again a subset of app development itself, but it is primarily on the baselines of creating an app which is like basically working for only the Apple products or Apple devices. So primarily, let's say iPhone, Watch OS, Mac OS. These are the devices wherein iOS development comes into play, and so it's different from Android because Android is again primarily just sticking to the Android devices. iOS only sticks to one iOS or Apple devices itself.
Got it. And the next question I had is there's some there's a new term known as hybrid app development, right?
Right.
So you had highlighted the difference between iOS versus Android development. So what is the difference between hybrid app development versus iOS app development?
So the thing is that when I talk about iOS app development, it is a very niche sort of a sector wherein it is just providing you apps that would go live for the Apple devices or something like that. But when it comes to hybrid applications, those applications are basically created for both the platforms or primarily, let's say, cross-platform systems. They go for Android as well as iOS. So in that scenario, it is a little more vast, not a niche thing, wherein you get a chance to work on both the platforms.
Got it. But the code base would be same in case of hybrid
Right.
app
So
development.
the thing is, it is a derivative of the same. So primarily, like let's say, basically everything is same. It's just that you get to create on both the platforms in hybrid framework.
Got it. And next thing is, how did you discover iOS app development, right? Because it's not so popular. Like let's say web development is very popular compared to iOS app development. Even Android is popular, like Kotlin with Java, but for iOS you need some specific specialized skills, right? So how did you discover app development?
So it's funny because the thing is that I actually wasn't supposed to get into iOS. When I started off in my second year, right during the COVID scenario started, I was trying to explore everything and everything that was going on in the tech market. So I did explore web development. I used to do data analytics. I used to do MLAI, but none of them actually clicked with me up until I reached iOS. So I don't know, for some reason, I felt a more comfortable scenario wherein I felt the comfort of iOS sort of environment that it provides, which I'm sure we'll discuss further as well. So the thing is that in iOS, the entire environment, or let's say the ecosystem that iOS systems create, right? So that was more preferable and more comforting to me. Plus, I enjoyed, developing in iOS apps. It was a lot more exciting. It had a lot of things that Android still is working on. Basically, the exposure of it was a little more better for me, and I just felt like I could, continue with iOS. Also, when like one of my seniors was into iOS at college, so that is how I got to know about it. And even I did my research. I was still wondering that is it important that one needs to get into one tech stack, or is iOS still relevant, or things like that. So eventually, I did ended up with iOS as my profession.
Got it. So the next common question is, okay, let's say now I've discovered iOS app development. What are the tools, frameworks, or programming languages that an iOS app developer should learn?
So thing is, I'll give you the very basic walkthrough of how an iOS app is created. You basically need an environment IDE, which is Xcode, and I would say that Xcode is one of the best like IDEs that I've come across. There might be some issues, but it is one of the most easy walkthrough of a user as a developer for me as well. We use it on Xcode. The language we use is Swift UI, which is not used in any other development tech stack. So let's say Java is used for web or backend or other tech, like scenarios, but in this case, iOS was the only one which uses Swift. Quite recently, a couple of years ago, they also introduced Swift UI, which is now again an essential part because it's been announced that another 2 years down the line, Swift will not be, used, and Swift UI will be the primary source of development in iOS. So that is another skill that is quite essential. Also, RX Swift, which is again a reactive Swift scenario, which is again an additionally new sort of a thing, but more of a exploratory system. So that's about it. In if I give you a general walkthrough, more about the skill sets that is required, I'd say one of the things that I've learned so far is it is very easy to develop a UI in terms of when you're first starting to learn. It is easier to understand how API frameworks need to be connected to the app, but one needs to be very well versed with data structures as well. So one thing we all don't exactly give the same priority level is also because it comes in my day to day, even the apps I create. So it's something that eventually has a lot of importance in this structure. So one of the skill sets we should actually mention is like that. In terms of iOS development tools, also if we talk about it, right? So in case of tools, also let's say Xcode is one. Then there's a simulator wherein we can basically virtually create the apps and run and check how it is working out. Also, I feel like it's not mentioned usually, but an iOS developer should be able to be well versed with Postman, should be well versed with Figma, all these minute things, because thing is that we're opening all three things at the same time and working around the same. So that is one thing I'd say.
Got it. And more deep diving, right? So let's say in case of web development, we know this front end and back end, right? In case of iOS, you told Swift UI, which acts as a front end to create the UI and all. So what are the backend frameworks or languages which are used while building iOS app? Is there a specific thing, or it changes according to company's tech stack?
So it depends on the company. So let's say when I was working at one bank, we did not use any third party integrations for any sort of API calls. But when I came to GetMyParking, we do use, or most of the companies use Almo Fire or Apollo or something like that, which is a third party integration for the apps API integrations. The thing is that there is no specific scenario of code or specific thing that tells you that you this is your backend segment of coding. It is basically just a like we have our own iOS derivative of calling an API, which we use in the application. So not too complex. Obviously, it does get complex with the size of the application, but a general walkthrough would be somewhere very similar to creating an app would be just calling an API and getting the data visually available.
Got it. And next, one more common thing is I've seen in the Apple ecosystem, right? Security is more taken into concern, right? At least in terms of data privacy, etc. So, what do as a developer? Is there any specific difficulty you face while implementing those kind of things in the application, right? In terms of, let's say, data getting encrypted, authentication flows, etc. Compared
Yeah.
to, let's say,
So
other
I'll
app
give you this
developers.
with an example. So when I was working in the fintech sector, we had a scenario wherein we were using a web view, right? Wherein a website is being called upon within the app itself. The thing which we got stuck for like couple of months was that permission of location. So it is a very small thing when it comes to a permission, but since iOS has a very rigorous process of app reviews, the couple of data privacies like checkpoints are a lot. So there's an entire checklist of Apple that they actually give as a guideline to before an app is in the market, a user or like a developer has to sort of adhere to all those checkpoints. So I'll give you an example. So location permission, camera permission, storing your data, all those things require a certain permission requirement. Even when you use your iOS devices, you would know there's always a permission that has to be given. And it's not something we do differently. It's just that since it is a guideline that has been provided to us, we have to make sure that every app like adheres to it. All these are completed and nothing beyond that. So primarily just focusing on what needs to be done to get the app through the process of review.
And the next question I had is, okay, now once anyone start applying for iOS developer intern or their first job, how should they build their portfolio, right? What are the basic projects they should start with, and then what are some like projects that they can add in their resume to get their first job or internship?
Right. So, can we talk about the resources also here? Because that will give
Yeah,
me a
yeah,
better walkthrough. Right. So,
correct.
the first thing I actually referred to in iOS was a program or a course on Udemy, which is by Angela Yu. So, I think every iOS developer is well aware about this. We've all been through it. She is one of the most like acclaimed for her iOS development course in Udemy. That's also because she gives us the most basic walkthrough on how to develop the app. She also makes us, create apps through the process. So while back at COVID, when I was just exploring the platform, it was a lot more helpful to get through everything in a roadmap itself. It is because courses are a lot more structured right now. So when they know like at what stage a developer needs to learn this, and if he's now ready, should we take him to the next one? So that scenario, it was a lot more easier because I walked through the like that specific course, and what I think more primarily would be that so there's this documentation that Apple provides, right? So Swift documentation is one thing wherein every basic Swift concept. So language learning cannot come from courses here in this scenario. It comes mostly because of that documentation. So once you get the gist of it, like what are closures, what are probably encryptions, what are structures, classes, you've learned them in different languages, but when it comes to Swift, I think the best is to go to the Apple documentation itself. That is a Swift developers documentation that is provided quite open to everyone. That is one another set point. So I've given you two for iOS and Swift basically. Now walking to another one would be, let's say if I'm starting to create a project after you've done this entire course or something, I'd say create a full blown app. So of recently, a friend of mine who just started to get back into the career after a long break of 2-3 months wanted to figure out, how to start off again. And I just mentioned you should create the app from scratch. That's how you will learn, and that's how you will be able to explore every aspect of app creation. So the thing is, I'd say always there's one app that everybody gets as a assignment as well, which is a weather API app. So weather apps, or I usually make clones of applications. So quite recently, I started working on a Zomato clone, and that is only because when you have a structured app in front of you, you know what all things need to be curated, and basis of that you get to explore a lot more things. So let's say even if I'm creating the home screen, I know that this will need a UI, this will need a backend. So in that whole process, I will be able to revise or work through everything, and that is how creating basic apps structurally would be a lot more helpful. Then there's also a couple of more apps that people usually create here. They eventually go for login sign up kind of apps. Some of them also work on, like, let's say screenshot creation apps, or something on the everyday problem that is most basic, but you can actually just work as a sample project.
And the next question is, okay, let's say now once we have learned, we have built the project, okay, we get the interview calls, right? So what are the interview rounds for a iOS developer?
Right. So I've given, like, let's say, I'll give you the most generic interview process. The first one would usually be an iOS development scenario of interview. So the first round of interview is primarily on the concepts of Swift, iOS development, and whatever work you've done before even as an intern, or if not on a personal level, any personal projects. So that is where they actually ask you the concepts of Swift language, like I mentioned from the documentation. So let's say what are closures, what are delegates, protocols, things like that. Then the second one is usually the data structures round. and they would expect you that you know Swift language enough to come up with lead code level questions of easy and medium under Swift language itself. So this is again one of the major skill sets, like I mentioned like in the beginning itself, like DSA is important. That is only because of when you're, even during the interview rounds, it is a very particularly a proper tech round which is conducted, and it requires you to do it in Swift language mostly. Very rarely, interviewer would allow you to continue in another language. So you have to be very proficient in the same, and you have to be good at your lead code skills as well. It's not going to be a very long or a hard question, not for most of the companies at least, but it will be checking your complex word like solving problems of kind of a thing. So yeah, I mean that would be one step. Then third round is primarily with the CTOs or engineering managers, which is again a problem solving kind of a round. But in this case, so I'll give you an example. I interviewed for a company many months ago. They asked me like to create a sort of a Ludo kind of a game. So snakes and ladders kind of a game using code, or let's say zero, or like tic-tac-toe kind of a game. So that need things are wherein the app development as well as your problem solving is combined. So that is the kind of a round engineering manager rounds are usually about. They try to come up with problems which are from real life, and we are supposed to come up with the solution. Last rounds are again obviously the HR rounds. So that would be the entire four-step. That is the most usual process.
Got it. And let's say, in generally, once if someone enters a career, starts their career as an intern or iOS developer, what are other things to do to stand out as an iOS developer, right? Like apart from work, like building side projects or communities or anything that you would recommend.
Right. So I think one of the best way is probably to, I've seen a lot of iOS developers actually write blogs on Medium. So that is one way wherein they get a chance to be like they get a chance to transfer the knowledge they've gained, also figure out where they, can improvise. So that's one thing that people usually do when they need to stand out on their portfolios, especially in our iOS sector, because not a lot of resources were available up until recently, but now that people have started writing, we do get a lot of answers on the internet. Then there's also the thing that they need to be more people need to start creating their own ideas of projects. So if you want to stand out, so when I did my BTech, I did a very personalized project in iOS. So that is what somehow always stood out in my most of my resumes, and not because what I did in my internships or my job, but my own personal project was a point of discussion at most interviews. So you need to have a good portfolio of having couple of good level of vast applications that you've created on your own, right? And things like that, plus being relevant. So I think that is quite important. So every day you need to be up to date. uh, let's say if I don't let's say I don't be like up to date right now, I might miss out on things that the other iOS developer would know. And every day there's something new that's adding on to this technology. Like quite recently, even at the Apple conference, they released a couple of new things. If I don't know about them and I'm asked about them in the interview, I would be not, the choice of preference here. So a couple of things like that wherein you can, start off. Coming to a little of resources and clubs as well, I'd say they are very helpful. So I recently, gave a session in Swift Bangalore as well. So how that helps me as an iOS developer is, first I get to, talk about iOS, because it gives me a lot of flair of the tech stack that I was, working on. So when I'm telling other people about it, I get a more brief understanding as well as a developer myself. Plus, being a part of such communities is also good because they give you an exposure in multiple other scenarios which you don't get to work on every day. So let's say there's something my company doesn't work on, CI/CD, let's say. So the other companies would, and the other speakers at these communities or organizations would talk about it, and that is how I would be more relevant, and I'd be much more updated about them. So yeah, communities, that there's a lot I can tell you. There's Swift Anytime. One of my friends actually created it. It's one of the largest platform in India for iOS developers. People usually should go ahead and they also give a newsletter. They organize a lot of events. Then there's Ray Wendelrich. He's a very renowned iOS developer in the world. You have to follow his newsletter to, be much more, because they actually come up with things which, just hit the market, and you might not have gotten a chance to work on them, but through their newsletters, you'll be a lot more in touch with what is going on. Yeah.
Got it. And let's say the job market, especially uh, on the context of that, how does the future of iOS development look like in terms of supply versus demand, right? So is there more demand of job, or is there less people who are looking for less quality talent available in the market?
So, like you mentioned in the starting of the podcast as well, there is a very less, or like slightly less popular scenario in case of iOS, and it is a pretty niche development sector. So, in terms of supply and demand, I think, from what I know of, iOS will always be in demand. More so because of the ecosystem Apple devices provide and the comfort that every user that uses them finds in them. So even if a couple of startups who now have gone on to hybrid systems, you will see that majorly all the big companies are still sticking to the native apps, and that's because they get a lot more, things to play around in the native like environment. So in that way, people usually still prefer to go ahead with native apps itself. And just because of that, iOS, if there's an Android app, every product will have an iOS app as a parallel. So it cannot happen that way, that you just give out one sector of users an app. So eventually the supply and demand is good. Supply relatively less, because in India especially, there's not a lot of people who have been doing iOS. In the other countries, it is a lot more available to the people here around there. So I think that job market, even if it is not working right now, it's a little unstable right now, but there's always hiring going on. Like I see every other day people are hiring in the same sector, and it's also because it's a they require people to create these apps, because they need like who have a niche experience in this itself.
And the quick question I had is, although you had already explained, but let's say someone who is in second, third, or fourth year of their college and they want to quickly start learning iOS development. You can give a quick plan, let's say, which is time bound, right?
Right.
That would be really helpful.
I basically, what I did is I actually jotted down everything that needs to be known as an iOS developer. So what every app needs, irrespective of iOS and Android, is a UI. It needs a backend. It requires the networking entire system data. It requires user interactions, right? So what happens is, like let's say, what I did is I firstly started off with creating UIs. Okay, and eventually I moved on to calling on APIs, getting data stored on it. Then after doing this like statically, some using some static data, I continued going on to dynamic data work around it. Then working on animations, things like additional features that let's say we add on to. So yeah, that would be the primary roadmap if you're going ahead. And like I mentioned in the course as well, when you're even when the course will go forward, you'll figure out that most iOS developers will figure out that it even that goes in the same step by step roadmap. So people need to know what multi-threading is. When you deep dive into API calling, you'll figure out that there's multi-threading, there's networking, there's concurrency. All those things need to be handled, so you have to study about them as well. When you're doing UI, you have to understand user interaction in terms of animations, in terms of giving a user good experience as a developer as well, because it's not just the UI that is going to account for, it is the experience. So yeah, that would be the basic roadmap. But once you do start creating the app, you have to eventually work on everything simultaneously. So yeah.
Got it. And any tips and tricks or any advice you want to tell people who are just starting or who want to become iOS developers?
Right. For the ones who are just starting, I'd say that they should actually start off with, even if they're doing a course, they should start like creating the apps on their own. The more you self learn, the more you will be able to pick up on the app development quickly and a lot more professionally. Because what happens is, when you're doing an app on your own, you might get stuck a lot more. But then eventually, when you come out of it after solving the issues, you'll be a lot more independent as a developer, and that's what companies look for. So that is one thing which every developer who's starting off should do. Also, iOS developers should, I'd say, subscribe to a couple of newsletters that come into the market right now. That's because, again, I mentioned being relevant, being a lot more well equipped about these things that are not usually used in the app on daily basis, but are important to be, understood about. So yeah, I'd say that are a couple of basic pointers.
Got it. Yeah, thanks a lot, Sejal. I think you had covered all the topics with examples, and it was really helpful for everyone. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.